Now let's turn to talking about the role of the firm, or the role that business firms play. Now, one way that we can think of a firm is that a firm is really kind of a pocket of voluntary central planning in an economy that is, on the whole, entrepreneurially planned. Right? Think about the normal structure of a typical business. Right? You have some board of directors, which acts very much like a central planning board for the resources that the corporation or the business has at its disposal. Right? Or you have some kind of upper management, right? Somebody that is making decisions with how are we going to use the various employees we have, the various materials we have, the various factories and finances that are available and are at our disposal. They're the ones making the decision, and they pass these decisions down through the various middle and lower managers, which you can really think of as acting somewhat like bureaucrats would in a fully centrally planned economy. And then these various middle and lower managers end up issuing orders to their employees that in turn will be the ones actually doing the tasks that they're being asked to do. So it feels very centrally planned. The big difference between a centrally planned economy and a firm is that it's on a much smaller scale. Right? So we're not talking about this firm trying to run the entire economy of Russia. We're talking about trying to run what are the resources that are available in the very small part of the economy that is our corporation. Even large corporations, it ends up, are relatively small compared to the economy as a whole. So that's really kind of what we would focus on here, is the difference is that the firm is very small. So then, but we still have the question, why would we organize things in this way? Right? Why would we organize things in this top-down, centrally planned approach, knowing that there are all kinds of problems involved with a centrally planned approach? Well, here are some benefits that come from adopting this firm type of structure. First is what we call lower transaction costs. A transaction cost is just the cost associated with making a transaction happen. Transaction costs are nothing new. These are something we deal with all the time. It is in fact probably why we plan to go grocery shopping every now and then, rather than just going out and buying each item as we need it. Because there's a very large transaction cost involved. Right? In this case, it would be a search cost, a travel cost. Right? Other examples would be a negotiation cost. Right? So if I am getting hired by somebody, right, we have to work out how much are they going to pay me to do the job that I'm going to do? What exactly are the traits of that job? What are the benefits that I receive? What are my expectations? And there's a negotiation process that goes on here. And that's not something we typically pay to do, but it is something that takes time, and that time is valuable. It is considered a cost. Right? Similarly, with search costs, right, that would be the time involved with going and looking for something. Probably one of my favorite examples of search costs happened in my life when I was making, was wonderful, a lemonade pie. Lemonade pie, it has frozen lemonade, ice cream, Cool Whip in it, and this nice graham cracker crust. It's a marvelous thing to have on a hot summer day. But one thing you need is frozen lemonade concentrate. So I went to the grocery store to buy frozen lemonade concentrate. The first grocery store I went to was sold out. The second grocery store I went to was sold out. The third grocery store I went to was sold out. Finally, the fourth one, where I was a good 20 minutes away from my house by the time I got to that grocery store, they finally had some. Right? So, sure, we could say, how much did that cost me? Well, it cost me $1.50 or $2 to buy this lemonade concentrate. But part of the cost in making that transaction happen was the searching involved to actually find the product that I wanted. Generally speaking, the more specialized a product is, the higher the search cost is for the thing. And so imagine now, if a business had to find new employees every single day. If the employees are specialized at all, the search is going to be very expensive. I've been part of the hiring process a couple times for finding new professors. This is a very time-consuming process. You have to sort through. Each person has a slightly different specialty. After all, academics are highly specialized, so we need to figure out, of our 60, 70, 100 applicants, how many of them have the specialty we want, and that is something that takes a lot of time. We have entire committees involved with trying to sort out which of these candidates are the best ones that we really should bring in. The search process is very expensive in terms of the time it would take. Then we have to go through the process, if you can actually find the employees every day, right? if you can do that in a reasonable time, you have to negotiate wages with them every day. Right? This is lots of time used for search and for negotiation that could be used for actually having people do their job if we extended to people a longer-term contract. And so you hire people not just each day you go out and you find new employees. Rather, you say, well, okay, you come to work with us. Right? We'll have a job here for you a certain number of hours every day as long as you show up. Right? We'll have these various responsibilities you can be expected to fulfill during that time. And it ends up, this saves us a lot in terms of search cost and negotiation cost. Now, I'd note, interestingly, when employees are not particularly specialized, and when wage negotiations can be simplified, we might actually sometimes see new employees being used every day. Here I have in mind things like day laborers. Not entirely legal as far as I know in the United States, but we do see images of this where people drive up and say, hey, I need a few people to work construction, I'll pay you $10 an hour today. And people hop in the truck and off you go. Right? This is something that can actually happen if the employees don't have to be particularly specialized, and if we have already a system set up where people can have some expectation of the wage they can expect, can have some expectation of where they can go to find such employees. But most of the time this is not the way things work. We do actually want somebody that's somewhat specialized and therefore more productive. A second benefit to organizing things in a firm, right, where we can have, say, longer-term contracts or develop these relationships, is what we call economies of scale. Economies of scale is just whenever larger scale production is more cost efficient. So this happens, for example, if you can double the amount you produce without doubling the total cost of production. Then we would say there are economies of scale. And this is very common in, say, manufacturing. Right? If you build a very small plant, the costs tend to be very high per unit you can produce. On the other hand, if you build a very large plant, you can generally increase the number of units you produce very, very quickly while your costs don't go up very much. So it's more profitable or more cost efficient for you to produce on a large scale. But for us to organize large-scale production, it requires that we have long-range planning, that we have a lot of resources available at our disposal in order to achieve these economies of scale. That requires that we set up a firm that can achieve these economies of scale. Economies of scope is very similar and is another benefit. Here we have in mind things like synergies. It would be a typical term for this, where producing one thing helps you be more productive at producing another. One example is if there's some kind of common technology involved. For example, I think of iPads and iPhones. And a lot of the technology in them, there's a lot of crossover in terms of the technology that goes in these two. Not necessarily the pieces of technology, but the knowledge that goes into how do you make this nice touch screen that works in a particular way very reliably and the like. Or that's something where there's common technology, so producing iPads makes it easier for us to produce iPhones effectively. So it makes sense that all of these should be housed under the same firm that is in effect a store of this common knowledge that is used in each of these production lines. Right, so firms can then be used to organize similar production in order to take advantage of economies of scope. Finally, there are economies of teams. Economies of teams is really just focusing on the human aspect of it, right? And saying that building a consistent team does actually help with productivity. After all, if you're on a team, you know that you can learn what are your relative strengths, who should we have focus on what. This is something we can kind of guess at from a resume, but you get better information when you're actually working with someone on a regular basis about what their strengths and weaknesses are. How do they work? How can you make them more productive? How can they make you more productive? Forming a team is something that is useful for this. We can improve the division of labor by recognizing what are our relative strengths. That lets us divide up what are the tasks we have to accomplish as a team, and who are the best people to accomplish these particular tasks. So in the end, firms do provide a number of great benefits, right? Economies of scale, economies of scope, economies of teams, lower transaction costs, right? By avoiding having to do search and negotiation all the time, anytime we want to, say, find a new employee. Firms allow us to create these benefits. At the same time, we know that there are costs involved with large-scale central planning. So really there's a balance here. We know that central planning's problems are much smaller on a small scale, especially if we're integrated into a larger market economy. Then we can do things like cost accounting, so a calculation problem isn't really that bad. So what firms end up trying to do then is to balance these benefits we talked about with the various costs involved, the difficulties of central planning. And what we'd expect to happen is that firms would grow to the point where these benefits and costs are more or less in balance. Or just hitting the point where information problems are showing up, or where incentive structures are difficult to get right, or where the computation problem is getting a little bit too difficult. So we'll tend to grow to the point where that happens. But of course, this is also going to be limited by how much are the benefits on the other side. It might be that there aren't very many transaction costs to start with. It might be that there isn't much room for economies of scale, scope, or teams. In that case, we'd expect firms to stay very, very small. On the other hand, if there are lots of economies of scale, we'd expect firms to get very, very large. Right? So normally what you can do, if you want to figure out, is a firm, does it have lots of economies of scale or not, right, you can just look at how big it is. Right. Large auto manufacturers, huge economies of scale involved. Barbers, not huge economies of scale. There are virtually no economies of scale there, so barbers tend to stay very small. Right. Auto manufacturers tend to be very large. Right. So in the end, firms are really trying to balance these two costs. And as long as it happens in a voluntary way, we would expect for them to do a reasonably good job. If they grow too much or grow too little, they end up being inefficient and will get weeded out by the marketplace.